Julius Caesar denays Pompey with Cato and other people sprinkled in there as well. The book begins with Caesar crossing the Rubicon and then the big battle of Pharsalus in Greece and the aftermath of that. But although the war happened about a century before Lucan's own time, so you can think back, if you're thinking nowadays, to like the World War I. It's about the same temporal dislocation. We can see as well, he takes a strong stance against Caesar and the empire in favor of the Republic, but he sort of chooses the losing side. For that reason, there's a lot of pessimism and despair and a sort of rejection of traditional models of heroism within the work. So the quote that I have here comes from the introduction to the bellum, to his epic. He says, "Great things such as civilization and democracy collapse on themselves. The gods have set this limit on the growth of happy things." So he has this really pessimistic, despairing view on the role that history plays, as he, as a narrator, has to narrate the history that he so despairs. I have what's in a name here anyways, because as you can see on the opposite side of the slide, that's a frontispiece from a 17th century edition of this. It has a different name, the Pharsalia, because we don't know what the actual title of this work is. Some people say Pharsalia, some people say bellum civile. Yeah, we also don't know how long it was supposed to be because we have an unfinished work as it is right now. Although as it stands as one of the more, the longest Roman epics that has survived in the modern era, and it still has a lot of the same literary depth and level of scholarship and introspection that Virgil's Aeneid or other works have as well. To take another detour, we have to talk quickly about the Homer and the Iliad because it has to be done in order to discuss the epic poetry of Lucan fairly. So the Iliad, as you may know, follows Achilles as he first quarrels with Agamemnon over the spoils of war and then joins the siege of Troy. It was composed around the 8th century BCE in Ionia, and it was considered foundational epic poetry. It was imitated and esteemed by both Greek and Roman authors for its role as an epic poem, insofar as it talks about like the deeds of past heroes and the interactions of gods and humans. Something you might notice is that it was composed about 900 to 1,000 years before Lucan lived, and also in Ionia. So in terms of the like how large the space of classics is, this time span is, it's about 1,000 years and goes from all the way from Spain to Turkey. So very large area of time and space. So a lot of changes took place. But despite that, there are essential structures and motifs that we can see remain the same throughout the epic genre over time. That's because within any genre, the texts are going to use patterns of language and style to sort of interact with cultural and literary norms. The example I have up here is about a call to adventure in an action or adventure movie nowadays, in which the Fellowship of the Ring, where Gandalf goes to get Frodo from the Shire to go begin an adventure, or something like Iron Man, the movie, the beginning of any work is going to matter a lot, but it's going to follow certain patterns and norms of how narratives are traditionally constructed within that social sphere. However, it isn't that every single movie is going to be exactly the same, of course. Authors are able to work within that structure to create creativity and novelty in a certain way. Within the epic genre itself, one of the ways that happened was something called a proem, which is the technical term for the first opening lines of the epic poem. For example, the Iliad famously begins with the word rage because it's about the rage of Achilles as he first refuses to fight and then after his friend Patroclus dies, begins to fight. So the first words are going to matter a lot. It's also it's programmatic in a sense because you can think of the first song on an album and how that might not be the best, but it's going to set a tone for how the rest. It might not be the climax of the album, but it's still pretty important. To get onto the texts finally, I've translated here a bit of the Iliad, the beginning lines of the Iliad and the beginning lines of Lucan's bellum civile. I bolded the beginning words of each of them. The Iliad begins with "Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Achilles, son Achilles, a curse which beset countless pains upon the Achaeans." So Homer chooses to begin the work with the Greek word "manus," meaning rage, and then it's sort of the technical term is an invocation of the muse because the word the goddess here, he's definitely talking about a sort of muse, a sort of divine, a representation of divine inspiration of poetry, in which it's a model of poetry where the poet is nothing more, is simply a channel for divine inspiration to flow through towards the audience. So it's really, at least in the frame of the Iliad, it's the muse doing the singing. Within the bellum civile, however, he chooses to begin the work with the word wars. I had to start with the word of because English likes the word of in order to make things make grammatical sense. But he says, "Of wars worse than civil in the Namathian fields, and just as given ode to sing, we sing." He specifically says we sing instead of invoking a goddess because Lucan is sort of responding to the Iliadic model of invoking a muse in order to reject that model of poetry, in order to talk about something as gruesome as civil war. I've also slide. I've also bolded here because at line 8 of the Iliad, Homer writes, "Who then of the gods brought them to fight, brought them to fight and strife?" But this is copied in the Bellum when he says, "What is this fury, citizens? What is this great anarchy of iron?" Sorry, it cuts off there, but the actual text reads, "What is this great anarchy of iron?" So what we can see here is that Lucan is sort of breaking the fourth wall of epic poetry in the way in which he says, what is this, because he's calling the citizens to account, i.e. the citizens of Rome, who are pretty much his audience, are being called to account for what they've done. So he's breaking apart this model of epic poetry and sort of rejecting it. But what exactly is it that he's rejecting? There's a sort of model of heroism in the Iliad and archaic Greece more generally, where epic poetry is a really key part of this system of praising ancient heroes and creating this sort of cultural structure that upholds that. In another part of the Iliad, Homer says, quote, "Sing to me now, muses who dwell in Olympian homes, for you are deities, present everywhere, seeing all things, but we hear chaos alone and know nothing." So this is a model, as we can see again, where the poet is nothing more than the channel for the divine inspiration to flow forth towards the audience. And I have the word kleos in italics because that's the original Greek term for glory. This is important because the word kleos etymologically comes from the Greek word for hearing, clue. The word actually doesn't mean, only comes to mean glory after centuries of people repeating the word and it being associated with the idea of glory, but originally it just means something that is heard. So this sort of etymology can sort of tell us that in archaic Greek society, the idea of glory was something that was socially produced through the act of poetry itself, and that poetry was very essential to that process in upholding these social structures. However, in the Bellum 1,000 years later, Lucan sort of has this idea, which I call glory's death. He has, in one section, he narrates a naval fight at Massilia, which took place during the Roman Civil War. He says, quote, "Often a wife, because the faces were mixed by the sea, believed she had the face of her husband, hugging a Roman corpse. Miserable fathers at burning body piles fought over mingled bodies, but Brutus, victor at sea, gave to Caesar's army its first oceanic glory, and uses the Latin word decus." So we can see here that in the passage beforehand, which I don't have up on the screen because it's rather long, he goes really in depth about the level of nastiness and brutality that occurred during this battle. And then he simply breaks it off with a really strong juxtaposition and says, "But Brutus, victor at sea, gave to Caesar's army its first oceanic glory." This is an absolute rejection of the sort of glory that Homer has. So Lucan is trying to move orthogonally in the poetic tradition away from the Homeric tradition. In terms of etymology, we can also see that decus, the Latin word, is tied to the Greek word doxa, i.e. it's something which adorns. It is a social marker that is bestowed socially as opposed to being created through poetry. So through this sort of wordplay, Lucan is able to create a sort of able to reject this Homeric model of poetry. In another section of the Bellum Cumulae, Lucan talks about the Battle of Pharsus. This occupies the seventh book of the epic, and it is the sort of the central part of the entire thing. He says, quote, "Here perishes all the glory of the fatherland in a great heap lie the patrician bodies." The idea that glory can die is something that is directly contradicts the Homeric tradition, where Achilles has a choice to either choose unfailing glory by continuing to fight or to go home and return to his father and not have unfailing glory because he will fail to win on the battlefield. However, Lucan says, no, even if you go to battle and you're still a war, you're still going to die on the battlefield and you're still going to perish as the glory of the fatherland. In another part of the same passage, Lucan says, quote, "This rage, this insanity, these are your crimes, Caesar. Flee this part of the war, my mind, and leave it to the shadows. Let no error learn of such abominations from me as poet, or of how much is permitted in civil wars. Better that my tears be lost and be lost the sorrows. Whatever you did in this clash of Rome, whereof I shall be silent." You can see that he uses the word in Latin is furor that he uses, but by sort of rejecting the idea of singing about rage to begin with, he is directly going against the model of the Iliad and sort of saying, I cannot do this when it's as gruesome as the Roman Civil War was. Sort of rejection of singing about that sort of violence, because it's better that it be forgotten. So the implications here is that the Iliadic model esteems martial glory and the poet's role in it. Lucan's rejection of it re-envisions the entire genre towards a model in which it's simply it's no longer does that same thing. This reckoning of the violence of a war and the brutality of Caesarism is sort of used as literary play, as I sort of went into with the wordplay that Lucan goes into, and he has a lot of other sections where he does wordplay sort of reject that model of poetry. And however, it still has unresolved questions about the possibility of justice and virtue in a time of civil war. And insofar as he's also espousing an imperialist model where Roman armies should go abroad instead of fighting other Romans. Yeah, so unresolved questions at the end of it as well. Questions? It's like a second.